On this episode, we focus on Virginia's economy in the light of changing demographics and economic realities brought on by changes in federal non-defense spending. Congress is in recess, and GOP town halls are getting real interesting. Updates on the General Assembly, including the bills on redistricting, coal ash, and e-voting. It's like 10 pounds of Virginia politics and news in a 5-pound bag. It's the For Virginia podcast. Thanks, and welcome to the For Virginia podcast for the week ending February 18th, show number 21. I'm your host, Michael Brennan Wade. Thanks for tuning in. First off, we've got some real big news. We're now on iTunes. Those of you who are used to listening to us on Facebook or YouTube can now subscribe to us on iTunes and take us with you on your phone and listen to us in a much more convenient way. You Android users can find our feed at forvirginia.org/feed/podcasts. And if you have no idea what we're talking about, thanks for listening anyways. We've had some feedback last week from someone asking that we cut out all the intro and get to through the beginning of the show right to the content. So we're going to follow that advice today and get right to it. We really have a lot to get through this hour, so let's jump right into it. We start tonight with Congress, more specifically the congressional response to Donald Trump's immigration ban. The Richmond Times-Dispatch, Evan Vucci, forgive me if I'm butchering that name, Vucci, has a nice editorial. Says, Virginia Democrats have roundly denounced Donald Trump's order on refugees, but while they are right to do so, it's also easy for them to do. State Republicans faced a much tougher test so far. Most of them have flunked it. Trump's order has received support of all four GOP congressional candidates, Ed Gillespie, Corey Stewart, Frank Wagner, and Denver Riggleman. Republican Attorney General candidate Chuck Smith supports it. His opponent, John Adams, is straddling the fence, but Reps Bob Goodlatte and Scott Taylor support it also. And Rep Tom Garrett supports it and then some. In a press release, Garrett points out the terrorist attacks by immigrants or second-generation radical Islamists, a.k.a. American citizens. Here in Virginia, we're fortunate to have two Democratic senators that seem to be pretty much in line with blocking as much of Trump's agenda as possible. Senator Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, of course. We talked a little bit last week about their actual counts on how many of Trump's cabinet members they had voted no against. I think it was like 5 and 4 or something like that. But the House of Representatives, on the other hand, is really where things need to step up, and congressional Republicans across the state have been really getting it when they return home. They're coming home this week for recess. I'm sure most of you have seen the Chaffetz video where Utah congressman who came back home and was had several hundred people show up and was asked some very tough questions during the town hall, kind of ran out in the middle of it. So things are really getting tense for some of these Virginia Republicans. Bob Goodlatte, first up on the block tonight. Got a trio of articles here. First one from the Northern Virginia Daily, that Congressman Goodlatte had a private lunch, invite-only lunch on Monday. But Goodlatte and his guests were not the only people present. 25 protesters outside the restaurant expressed their concerns about the way they feel Goodlatte has been representing them. The News Leader reports that Goodlatte did not respond to a question. His office did not respond to a question about when he last held a public town hall meeting. He did respond to a second inquiry that the date would have been August 2013, where he hosted a town hall in Verona. Goodlat's office responded, quote, "I've always made it my priority to communicate with the people I represent and strive to be in communities across the district as often as possible. I must meet regularly with groups or individuals who have requested appointments, attend community events, and correspond with constituents who have contacted my office via phone, email, postal mail, and social media. In addition, I host telephone town hall calls, including one yesterday that allowed me to reach thousands of people at once and take questions from callers as they all listen. I appreciate the input of all my constituents. I'm looking at their town hall meeting requests." And so the last article from the Roanoke Times was that during that call, he was asked about a indivisible event that is sprung up called the People's Town Hall for Bob Goodlatte, which will happen on February 22nd of this week. The leader of the Roanoke Indivisible group said, quote, "Representative Bob Goodlatte has not held a town call with his constituents since 2013, so we are organizing one for him." That's according to the organizers. Another article from Roanoke Times goes into a little bit more about Goodlatte and also mentions Tom Garrett, who is a first-term congressman out of Lynchburg and Roanoke. Garrett hosted his second online Q&A session, hosting a Facebook town hall. Indivisible Charlottesville held a weekly demonstration in front of Garrett's Charlottesville office the day after the Facebook Live meeting, handing out cards and notes in the spirit of Valentine's Day. Indivisible Charlottesville, along with Indivisible Nelson County, been holding a number of events. This is from the Daily Progress. Barbara Comstock is getting the same treatment. Activists plan to hold town hall in Representative Comstock's Northern Virginia district with or without her. She held a telephone town hall Wednesday night that lasted an hour and 15 minutes. Said there were more than 6,000 constituents listening in. Only a dozen were able to speak to the Congresswoman. It's from the Washington Post. She also got the Valentine's Day treatment, according to the Loudoun Times. And two separate demonstrations took place side by side outside of her office in Winchester. That was on February 17th. So Thursday? Friday? And Dave Bratt, announcing on Valentine's Day that he would hold the first in-person town hall meeting of his second term on February 21st in a restaurant in Blackstone, Nottoway County. This is from the Daily Progress. In a January interview on the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Bratt said, quote, "I had one woman on my Facebook say she was going to get up in my grill. There's paid protesters, paid activists on the far left, not my Democratic friends I go to church with. They're being paid to go around and raise havoc." Well, I'm sure you, as am I, are waiting for my protester paycheck. I'm not seeing it. I'm sure it's in the mail. I'm sure Soros or some of those Obama holdovers in the Justice Department or the intelligence community are just waiting to get those things out to us. And just going to go check my P.O. box this week. And we'll finish up with my own congressman, freshman from Virginia's 2nd District, Representative Scott Taylor. We'll get to him a little bit later with his voter fraud comments, I think. But he is hosting 3 town halls, to give him credit. Kempsville, Virginia Beach, Yorktown here on the peninsula, and then I think he's doing one on the Eastern Shore Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So he is, it's going to be fun. I can't wait. Tuesday night, York County High School. I'm going to have to make sure that I write my zip code on a sticker or something so he knows I'm not one of these people who are being bussed in apparently to protest and raise a ruckus. But again, as last week, big shout out to all the people in the invisible groups that are doing their thing and keeping the pressure on. We're really looking forward to this next week. Congress is home for recess, and these town halls are going to be something else. So keeping up the pressure and hopefully get some of these guys to do what's right. I mean, we won't get into Trump per se, but I think most people listening are as concerned as I am about what's been happening with the accusations flying out following Flynn's dismissal from the National Security Advisor and everything else going on. Again, we'll focus on Virginia for now, and focus on Virginia's congressman. Last week, I attended the Virginia Chamber of Commerce's 7th Annual Virginia Economic Summit in Williamsburg, where representatives from ODU's Center for Economic Analysis and Policy presented their 2016 State of the Commonwealth report. The Virginia Economy in Transition, the first section of the report, says that the economy only grew at 1.4% last year. That's much better than the 0.1 and 0.2% that we experienced from 2013 and 14, but was still only good enough to move us from 48th to 33rd in the ranking of 50 states. Hampton Roads experienced 3.7% growth, Richmond 3.9%, and the Northern Virginia area, which accounts for 42% of Virginia's metropolitan GDP, saw only 1.3%. Now, the report attributes much of this dismal growth to Virginia's reliance on federal spending, which is almost 30% of state's GDP. Sequestration was a factor, and we've lost over 25,000 active duty personnel since 2000. The report claims that we saw a $10 billion reduction in federal defense and non-defense contracts, most of which impacts Hampton Roads, Fairfax County, and Arlington. The good news is that wage growth outpaced inflation. But the bad news is the labor force participation has been declining so much that the labor pool is shrinking. Now, what to make of this is a bit different since there are several hypotheses to explain the drop, and there doesn't seem to be a definitive evidence to any specific cause, right-wing commentators withstanding. The authors of the report by the Chamber claim that discouraged workers and systematic unemployment are the most important factors, but together those only account for half of the change. Now, the first of these hypotheses is the discouraged worker hypothesis that Sean Hannity and other people would tout during Obama's presidency, or like to blame on Obama, which is the idea that somehow the reported unemployment rate is somehow leaving out a whole number of people who are discouraged workers, so to speak. So the people who, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports a 5% gap between the U3 unemployment figure, which is the one that is reported on the news all the time, and the U6 rate that includes underemployed and discouraged workers. So you can see these charts and see that it's well accounted for, and it's not like a mystery as to how many of these people there are. The second hypothesis is the aging population, which you would think that as labor force participation would drop among a population as they age, but statistics actually show that the opposite is happening. Anecdotally, I have heard from retirees in certain fields that young people are not interested in the jobs anymore, and so they are forced to continue working either because they need the extra income or because there is no one else to do the jobs. Now, you might want to think of dirty jobs like plumbing or things of that nature. But again, that's just my anecdotal evidence, but there are statistics that are documented on this within the report. The third theory is the generous safety net, aka the welfare queen theory. Now, the Chamber authors claim that this report has limited empirical validity and that it doesn't account for more than 10 to 20% of the variations in labor force participation. Rising disability claims is another factor, but accounts for no more than 1/5 of the recent declines. And in past years, increased college attendance was a factor, meaning that as people went to college, they would drop out of the labor force in order to attend school, but this no longer seems to be a factor. Now, this all seems to represent a bit of a mixed bag for Virginia. Unemployment is down, wages are up, but the labor force is shrinking. Our reliance on defense spending means that we will likely not see growth in excess of 2% for 2016 or going into 2017. This is especially concerning given Virginia's performance relative to other states. Now, the Chamber recommends the following actions to spur growth. 1, investments in research and development. 2, improving the education system. 3, developing exports. 5, I'll quit counting them, but diversify the economy, improving transportation, economic development efforts for new or expanding business, and improving regulatory climate. Now, a lot of these are generic recommendations that you would expect from a pro-business organization. And things like improving the education system are unnecessarily vague and don't offer any specific recommendations. A few other random notes that I pulled out of this was the 75% of job creation in Virginia comes from growth in existing firms. And the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, which we've trashed quite often on the show back several months ago, created 20,000 of the 67,000 jobs created by the state in 2015. Now, that was a recap of where we were in 2016. Now let's take a look at some articles that have come up for this year and talk about what we can expect moving forward. Now, Virginia's reliance on the federal government has been one of the things that Governor McAuliffe has tried to change and spur innovation and growth in the private sector outside of the economy. The sequestration definitely hit Virginia, as I mentioned earlier, and it remains unclear what exactly what effect the Trump administration will have on the Virginia economy. Now, Huntington Ingalls, or Newport News Shipbuilding, just had a gangbuster year. Huntington Ingalls reported a 294% profit gain for the fourth quarter in 2016. Now, I don't know exactly how much of it is due to accounting issues from a buyout, acquisition that they did, but we're talking about a difference between $50 million in profit last year to $197 million this year. But their full year profit was almost a 42% gain, $573 million. Now, for those of you that aren't already aware, Newport News Shipbuilding is the largest industrial employer in Virginia. It has over 20,000 employees. It is the nation's only designer, builder, and refueler of Navy aircraft carriers and one of 2 providers of submarines. And following this gangbuster year, they are looking to hire 3,000 additional workers, which is great for the area. Now, from the Suffolk News Herald comes news that Virginia ports are doing really good as well. The Port Authority announced late last week that they had an 18% growth in volume compared with January of last year, looking at 8% year-to-year growth. And that's including the snowfall. The port is in the middle of a 3-year expansion plan at Virginia International Gateway and Norfolk International Terminals, looking at $320 and $350 million expansions at either of those locations. So they're expecting a positive job growth effect over there. Warehouses and distribution centers are in Suffolk and the surrounding region are expanding operations as well. And there is signs that exporters will be benefiting as well. Tyson's Corner is also seeing rapid development as well. And it seems to actually be defying logic, according to the CEO of the Fairfax County Economic Development Authority. He says, quote, "We have disposed of all the laws of supply and demand in Fairfax County, in particular in Tyson's Corner. We're playing whack-a-mole in Tyson's Corner. If we fill an office building, another one pops up over here." Now, what that fares for traffic in Tyson's remains to be seen. Pedestrian accessibility continues to be a problem in Tyson's. Planners have concentrated development in 4 nodes near the metro stations, but it's rare for people to walk between them. Cybersecurity firms have gravitated to Fairfax County to protect environmental agencies and corporations. Capital One is a huge need for information security technology information specialists. As Governor McAuliffe is wont to say, Northam as well, there are 17,000 open cybersecurity positions in the state of Virginia that equate to about $80,000 a year salaries. And so we have a few sectors of the Virginia economy, a few areas that are doing really well. The problem is outside of the metropolitan areas like Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Southampton Roads, things aren't doing quite as well. So, I mean, we mentioned that based on the chamber report, you're seeing 3.5% growth in some of these areas. But when you factor in negative growth in some of the other cities, rural areas and so forth, that it actually drags the Virginia economy rate down to around 1% or less. Now, what is the bad sign of what's happening is that Virginia's population growth is slowing down. The Pilot is reporting that Virginia's population is growing at its slowest rate in nearly 100 years, and a rate not seen since the 1920s. The state is continuing to add residents in 2016, but at declining levels, which is actually began in the 1980s. This is fastest shrinking areas are in the rural area: Buchanan County, Dickinson, Greensville, Wise, Surrey, Brunswick, Lunenburg, Allegheny, Mecklenburg, and Russell County are all seeing between negative 6.7 and negative 4.2% growth, which still, they're still growing, just slower. You look at a place like Loudoun County, which has a whopping 23% growth, Falls Church 14, Arlington, Alexandria, New Kent, Charlottesville, Prince William County, Fredericksburg, Harrison, and Manassas are all seeing between 14 and 10% growth. But again, Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hampton Roads have accounted for 93% of all the new people coming into the state. Virginia is still the 19th fastest growing state, but it's been moving down. So the research associate at the University of Virginia, Hamilton Lombard, says that people are moving south for warmer climates, lower cost of living, and faster growing economies. But the sequestration and the death to birth imbalance are also having a factor in this as well. The Roanoke Times also covered this issue as well this past week, noting that this is the first time that Virginia has experienced what demographers call an out-migration since the federal government started recording stats since 1978. Quote, "So we ask again, what's happened? Demographics and economics have happened. That's what. The demographics part is that we have an aging population, and as Virginia's baby boomers retire, many of them do what other generation of retirees do before them have done. They move south. If you look up and down the East Coast, you'll see the slowest population growth in the Northeast, the fastest from North Carolina south. In between, Virginia's population growth tracks along with Maryland and Delaware. Demography is destiny, so too, apparently, is geography." And the economics part goes like this. What has been the state's two biggest economic engines, Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, both have their economies tied to the federal government. The slowdown in federal spending caused by sequestration has had the effect of stalling economic growth there. That's why last year the Republican General Assembly passed and the Democratic governor signed a $2.2 billion bond issue aimed at laying the foundations for a new economy in the state, with investments in science-heavy projects such as the Virginia Tech Carillon, I'm sure I'm butchering that word, School of Medicine and Research Initiative. That's why there's been push from the state business community for the Go Virginia initiative that to invest $86.5 million through two economic development boards. And that's why all the candidates for governor are focusing on jobs. Which now brings us to our senators. Now, I don't want to bore anybody with statistics, but I will quote from Greg Juneman out of the Virginian Pilot, who has a nice article, the headline, "Help Wanted, Senators Needed." It goes on to talk about how last year Norfolk Naval Shipyard was posting help wanted ads trying to alleviate a critical shortage of engineers, technicians, boilermakers, electricians, mechanics, welders, and workers in more than a dozen other job classifications, but now they're not. 3 days after his inauguration, one of his first official acts, Donald Trump signed an executive order freezing civilian hiring across the federal government. With the stroke of a pen, Norfolk and 3 other naval ships were denied the necessary personnel to perform urgent maintenance and repairs on the Navy's fleet of more than 270 ships. Now, how many of you remember Donald Trump's campaign promise to rebuild the Navy? There's been a lot of talk over the years about the 350 ship Navy. I know Randy Forbes kind of relied on it. It didn't help him with his loss to Scott Taylor. But getting back to Juneman's article, he says that the help wanted now that's desperately needed is for Virginia's senators to explain the critical work that takes place at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard and to get a waiver for the policy. Now, he's saying that Tim Kaine, neither Mark Warner, has been pressing the shipyard issue. Kaine complained on NPR about how the freeze would affect rural post offices, which Juneman claims it doesn't, but didn't say anything about the defense facility in Tidewater. Just days after Trump's executive order took effect, a bipartisan group of senators wrote to Secretary of Defense James Mattis asking for a waiver for civilian employees at U.S. Navy shipyards. 8 senators from 4 states signed on to those bills. I won't list them, but absent from them are the signatures of Kaine and Warner. And it's kind of strange why this is happening. More than 8,500 workers are now directly employed at Norfolk Naval Shipyard. And again, if the U.S. Navy is recommending increasing its fleet to 350 ships from 270 that they have now, then there's a lot more jobs that could be affected there. So the question for Mark Warner and Tim Kaine is why they're not speaking out on this issue on behalf of the Defense Department in Hampton Roads. Now, I know it's a little strange. Well, you may not think it's strange for me, but I'm sitting here asking myself as the words come out of my mouth why I'm so concerned with the buildup of the Navy. You know, I'm not a fan of the military-industrial complex by any means, but I do recognize the number of jobs that are affected by this and hope that people understand that. So quick notes on the coal industry. There were 2 articles that I wanted to point out about coal exports and DC's love for coal that were both in the pilot. So the first article about coal exports was out on the 11th. Now, here in Hampton Roads, in Newport News, we actually have a large coal export terminal. Norfolk Southern has one in Kinder Morgan and Dominion as well. Sorry, the Norfolk Southern one is at Lambert's Point, and then the other 2 are in Newport News. So every day when I do drive by the Monitor Merrimack Tunnel and pass these huge piles of coal, it's very disheartening to see those, and I would love nothing more than to see them disappear one day. They seem to be a reminder of, our fossil fuel economy. And it's amazing to see these huge, large mountains of coal, and then they have these conveyor belts that rise over them. And what you'll see during the summertime is that they'll actually be spraying water on them, I guess, to keep them from spontaneously combusting or causing coal dust to blow away. You can definitely smell it when you drive by there. And, there's a series of apartments and condos, not condos. I mean, they're probably what I would describe as lower income housing over there. And so it's kind of not the greatest area in the world. But together, those 3 terminals are down 22% from last year. But there seemed to be, that data was from January through November. They were down 22%. And then in December and January, they spiked 42%, 44% in January. January was the port's best month for coal exports since March 2015. Now, what's going on is that there are different types of coal. So there's metallurgical coal, or met coal, which is used in steel making, and then steam or thermal coal, which is used in electric power plants. Now, don't ask me to explain what the difference are, but only about 2% of the coal moving through Hampton Roads is actually being sent out to utility plants. The rest of it is actually exported and is apparently high quality coal. So the price for met coal took off in November to $300 a ton, which I guess is a lot. And so that's been blasting off. Now, how this affects the railway companies is important as well. So in 2011, coal was 31% of Norfolk Southern's total railway and served 100 coal-fire powered plants. Now, the 2016 report says that it accounts for 15% of Norfolk Southern's railway operating revenues and has dropped to 78 coal plants. And fun fact, the Hampton Roads coal export terminals are the largest coal exporting port in North America, accounting for 38% of all U.S. coal exports. Now, a few days after that article was published, the pilot followed up about coal's ascendancy in Washington, D.C., quoting Trump as saying, "We'll unleash the full power of American energy, ending the job-killing restrictions on shale oil, natural gas, and clean, beautiful coal." And they go on to say that the only way to do that is to change the economic reality of America and the world's electricity sector, saying that the decline of coal is beyond the control of any single man or political party. Now, of course, listening to Republicans and right-wing media, you would think that this is all Obama's fault due to the war on coal, but it's not. Coal use for electricity has plummeted in recent years for several structural reasons, starting with the fact that it no longer enjoys a price advantage over natural gas or now even solar power. Fracking has made natural gas so cheap that you can't justify the cost of coal. And solar power uses free fuel, wind, nuclear. All of these are cheaper than coal. You may have heard me talk on this program before about my Medium.com war with Senator Ben Chafin over the coal tax subsidies. We've probably talked about it on this program before. I'm not going to get into all the details on that again, but needless to say, the Republicans in the General Assembly last year voted to try and extend coal tax subsidies for coal companies that were not having the effect that they were supposed to have. I'll just leave it at that. The money was basically going to executives of these coal companies that were enjoying these tax subsidies while they laid off their workers, stiffed them on their pensions, and shirked their environmental responsibility laws to clean up the state. And, spent all this money on campaign donations to the General Assemblymen and senators and House members. But I digress. The article goes on to talk about the technological advancements of clean coal, so-called clean coal, and ongoing efforts to develop technology to mitigate the environmentally bad effects of burning coal for electricity. So, I hope I have lectured everyone enough for today on Virginia's economy. If you're still listening and haven't bored yourself to death or crashed your car from falling asleep, then congratulations. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll start talking about the elections for governor and General Assembly updates right after this break. Stay tuned. So let's turn our attention to the governor's race for a moment. Tom Perriello, who is the challenger to Ralph Northam's previously unimpeded quest for the Democratic nomination for governor, has been quite active the past few days. First thing, actually, I might have these backwards, but he called for 2 years of free community college for Virginians on Friday. Quote, "One of the best pathways at this point to the middle class is through nursing and some of the other programs that are so well done here," he said after during a stop in Roanoke and a tour of southwestern Virginia. He said he would push to make 2 years of community college a career and technical training free for Virginians. He said he thinks the idea would draw bipartisanship because the community college system is popular across party lines, and getting people into the workforce and paying taxes has appeal for conservatives. He did not offer any details on how such a program would be paid for, and I called him out earlier today on Twitter saying so much. We have a $1.6 billion budget deficit. Schools are already, public universities are seeing a cut in state finances. I think CNU, that accounts for, almost 10% of their budget or something like that. So I was like, how are you going to pay for this? To be honest with you, it seems, he's trying to be the Bernie Sanders to Northam's Hillary Clinton. That analogy is a little tortured there, but he's cutting left as hard as he can, I guess, in order to get Ralph to go along with him and kind of distinguish themselves. He did something similar with the natural gas pipelines, declaring himself against them. He vowed, being elected governor, quote, "I'll use all legal authorities I have to prevent these pipelines." Now, the Roanoke Times, who we're using as a source on both of these articles, has an editorial about the natural gas, saying, quote, "Politically, it's a brilliant move. In one bold stroke, Perriello energizes environmental activists, underscores his liberal street cred, and outflanks his competitor for the Democratic nomination." And then they also say that it's basically showmanship. And they say we don't mean that as a compliment either. Saying that Perriello has declared his heartfelt opposition is something he can't do anything about. The agency that will determine whether the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and Mountain Valley Pipeline go forward is a federal one, not a state one. I heard, just as much from John Fredericks last week as well. Perriello is saying he'd like to order a state agency to make a political decision that's supposed to be a scientific one, which sounds a lot like what liberals accuse the Trump administration wanting to do, just with different results. They go in to talk about Corey Stewart. It sounds like he's running for the head of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Denver Riggleman is worked up over Charlottesville's decision to move a statue of Robert E. Lee, saying that Perriello, Stewart, and Riggleman occupy quite different points on the political spectrum, but they're all trying to do the same thing: get supporters fired up, even if the issues they're raising have nothing to do with the office they're seeking. But the reason I really wanted to point this article out, they have some really good questions that they want candidates for governor to ask, things that they can actually do something about. And I'll just roll through them real quick. What are you going to do about the school funding crisis in Virginia coal fields? What are you going to do to reverse the state's demographic trends? We talked about those earlier. More people leaving the state than moving in. They'll say we need more jobs, and that's true. However, instead of mouthing the usual slogans about small business, how about they answer this? What do you do to attract more investment capital? Right now, Virginia draws only 1% of the nation's investment capital. How are you going to close the skills gap between the skills our workers have and the skills that jobs being created actually require? They go on to talk about Franklin County, where the current career and technical center is so crowded that most students who want to get in can't do it. So where do we get the money to fix the skills gap? Where do we get the money to pay for 2 years of public education? I mean, I was a Bernie Sanders supporter, and talking about free education or free public education at the federal level is a little bit different than talking about at the state level. The federal government has deficit spending. Virginia does not. So any cuts to, or any programs such as free public education like this would require cuts in other or revenue expenditures in other places. So I would like to know how Perriello intends to pay for it. I mean, are we talking about a tax increase on income tax rates in Virginia? Let's talk about it. I mean, it seems like the whole Sanders-Clinton thing over again. Obviously, that doesn't bode well, but there's some more good news on that in a minute here. So from the Winchester Star reports on a Quinnipiac poll that has Northam and Perriello deadlocked at 19% as the candidate for Democratic primary. Now, the main factor in this is that 61% of state Democrats remain undecided. Most people don't even know who either of these people are, which is unfortunately the state of Virginia politics here. Now, this is obviously good news for Perriello, and I had tweeted or posted a link to a poll on Blue Virginia. When I first looked at it, there was only 100 or so responses, and it was overwhelming for Perriello. I checked it out later in the week or a few days ago. Here we have the final results of the poll. Has Northam at 50.7%, Perriello at 48.3% out of 4,762 votes. So that is quite interesting as it bodes for the race. I mean, Blue Virginia is obviously going to be your hardcore Democratic people. Again, we're talking about 60% of the people who were surveyed by Quinnipiac that had no preference. So we talked a lot about Perriello, so let's talk about Northam for a minute. The big thing that he came out of him earlier this week was that he has called for decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana, saying enforcement is expensive and disproportionately jails African Americans. Kudos, Lieutenant Governor. And this is coming from a physician. And we'll talk more about the medical marijuana as far as the General Assembly is concerned. Those of you who know me know that one of my first forays into politics or activism really was through the Virginia Marijuana Legalization Project, vmlp.org. We have a website, but it mainly active on the Facebook page for the most part, just as a news aggregation thing. So I've written articles that have appeared all over the place on that site, on Alt Daily. They go into great detail about the arguments for decriminalization. The big person with regards to that is Adam Eben out of Alexandria. He tried several years in a row to try and get that passed, shot down by the Courts of Justice committees, basically Senator Tommy Norment and Mark Obenshane out of Harrisonburg, basically the co-chairs of that committee that has stopped any forays into the decriminalization effort. I think, 20,000, 25,000 people a year that get arrested for that. Northam comes up with a different figure for the total cost of that. I said it was basically about $130 or $160 million a year that we spend on enforcement and incarceration efforts with regards to that. Don't see it on this article, but he comes up with a much smaller figure. And my take on that is that if, we're going to spend, $100 million on marijuana enforcement, but we're going to make $160 or $140 million a year from the Virginia Alcoholic Beverage and Control Department. So the hypocrisy is really what I see it as. Not to mention as Northam correctly notes, the disproportionate effect of marijuana arrests on the African American and people of color population. So, and let's not forget the GOP candidates. We really only going to talk about Stewart today. Richmond Times-Dispatch reporting that Corey Stewart allies with alt-right inspired blogger who wants to protect, quote, glorious Western civilization. Now, we had mentioned this guy before. He is the dude that tried to get Charlottesville's Wes Bellamy, the city's black vice mayor, who was pushing for the Confederate removal of a Confederate statue. Bellamy, of course, is the guy that posted misogynistic, homophobic, and anti-white comments on Twitter before getting elected to the Charlottesville City Council. And so this guy, Jason Kessler, 33-year-old writer and journalist behind the group called Charlottesville's Unity and Security for America. They even put Pepe the Frog on their website. Yeah. So we won't get into we won't rehash the Bellamy episode, but it looks like Stewart is getting in bed with this guy. There was actually another article in the Washington Post about a rally, I guess, that Stewart held defending this Confederate statue and getting hit with a lot of, I guess, protests while he was there. They were trying to shout over him while he gave an interview and so forth. And Stewart, of course, is the guy that used to be the Trump campaign manager before he got fired for trying to upstage Trump. Gave away an AR-15 as part of a campaign event. So I think pretty much everything that I've read about him, I'm probably not even going to give him much focus on this show moving forward, but he probably will not be the nomination for the Republican GOP candidacy. Remember, kids, don't burn your bridges. So let's talk about the General Assembly. So literally an hour ago, while I was in the middle of producing this episode, the Richmond Times-Dispatch just reported that Speaker Howell is going to retire from the House of Delegates. William Howell of Stafford, I believe that's also Fairfax or Fredericksburg, excuse me, who's been the Speaker of the House for the past 15 years, will retire, will announce his retirement on Monday. So expect to hear more about that next week. I'm not sure if anybody was actually in line to challenge him, but that is definitely going to shake things up in the delegates race. Now, we want to talk about some other entries into the race and changes in the race very quickly. In District 2, we have Jennifer Carroll, who is going to be seeking the Democratic nomination. She will be in a primary versus Josh King, who ran last year against Mark Dudenheffer. Josh came within 140 votes, I believe. It was a very narrow margin after filling in quickly in the middle of the campaign after the candidate, the then Democratic candidate, dropped out of the race. So primary between Jennifer Carroll and Josh King coming up in District 2. In District 12, sound like I'm announcing the Hunger Games here. District 12, this is big. Roanoke newscaster Chris Hurst will be entering the race against Republican Joseph Yost. Now, Hurst, you might recall, is the boyfriend of reporter Allison Parker, who was killed on air by a coworker. Was that 2015? I can't remember, but he resigned his post at the television company or television channel that he worked at last week to announce his entry into the race. Now, District 13 against Bob Marshall is really getting crowded. We now have 3 entries in the race. Attorney Steve Jansen entered the race last week. Also in that primary is going to be Danica Rome, the first transgender, seeking to be the first transgender delegate. Mansimran Kalan, who wants to be the first Sikh delegate. Against Bob Marshall in the 13th. And in the 31st, we have Sarah Townsend, who has entered the race, and don't have her biography in front of me, but she is entering. She ran before against Scott Lingmefelter. I'm probably butchering that name. She ran against him last year and just re-entered the race. I recall now. She has actually got her master's degree in education. I think she's a teacher But she's going to be running against Elizabeth Guzman, who wants to be the first Latina delegate. Guzman, we've met her. She's very nice. We talk and wish her the best of luck against Sarah. So we'll see how that goes. And in the 64th district, accused child abuser Rick Morris, who is currently voting on bills in the General Assembly as we speak, will be facing a challenger in the Republican primary by the name of Emily Brewer. If I recall correctly, she is an adoption advocate. I think that's going to be her main focus. God, can't wait for the debates on that one, huh? So she's going to be challenging Rick Morris, and then the winner of the Republican primary will be facing Democratic challenger, I believe his first time, John Wandling. Spoke to him on the phone a few weeks ago. He's an old retiree from the IT department like me. So hopefully one of them will beat Rick. Either one of them would be a better choice. So those are the updates on the 2017 delegate elections that are coming up. Very important to me. Of course, I'm running in the 91st here in Hampton, Poquoson, and York County. So a quick recap on the General Assembly's ongoing activities in the past week or so. Redistricting reform, that's probably the big news on everybody's plate. Saw the most articles about that this week. Is dead. Most people are aware of this already, so I won't go into too much detail about it. The couple of scathing editorials that Jeff Shapiro, had one, and the other from the Virginian Pilot was pretty interesting. So the good news is that the vote was recorded this year, so Virginians can get a good look at the legislators thwarting democracy in Virginia. Richmond Times-Dispatch reported that Luke Torian, Mark Stickles voted to report the bills to the full committee, while delegates Margaret Ranson out of Westmoreland, Mark Cole out of Spotsylvania, Chris Jones of Suffolk, and Buddy Fowler of Hanover voted to kill them. I can't remember where I saw it, but somebody basically pointing out that it may have been Shapiro's, but when Democrats had the majority last time in the General Assembly, not sure what year that was, but they had the opportunity to make things a little nonpartisan, and apparently it was even worse than it is now. So there seems to be kind of the question of whether the Democrats are paying for their sins this time round. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of wins to make things a little more even in the future. One of the really good things that I want to point out is that I think the Democratic House Caucus is going to be fielding a record number of candidates. That may be a relative term as far as recent memory goes, but there's going to be a lot of people running for office this year that have not declared or have declared already, but we're going to have a huge number of candidates running to challenge some of these incumbents, which is great news. So moving on, the coal ash cleanup bill passed committee with amendments. And this is basically an attack on Dominion, who has several coal ash facilities in the state that they basically, they're storage units for coal ash. And they basically want to close them off. And what the bill does requires them to report on the environmental impact of the facilities before they can actually do it. Now, the original bill would have prevented the utilities from actually getting the permits in order to close the facilities, but the amendment, the bill was kind of poisoned, if you will, in the committee process. A crucial provision which required that no permits be issued before the assessments have been reviewed and evaluated by state officials was excised in a subcommittee on Monday. And in the version that passed the committee on Wednesday, it was replaced with language declaring that the director of the State Department of Environmental Quality, quote, shall not suspend, delay, or defer the issuance of any permit, end quote, pending the completion of the assessment. So basically, what it was supposed to do is it was supposed to prevent the permits from being issued until the utilities would provide the environmental assessment, and the DEQ would then look over it and then give their yay or nay. But basically what's doing now is that they still have to provide the information to DEQ, but they can go ahead with the process in the meantime. So, side note on that, the coal ash plan near the Potomac River faces renewed opposition, according to the Washington Post. 1 million tons of coal ash at Possum Point plant near the Potomac River. So there is a hearing scheduled for Thursday. Let me see the date on this, February 13th. So yes, that would have already happened on the 16th, I believe. So Dominion, which stopped burning coal at Prince William County site in 2003, has been storing the ash in 5 retention ponds. These are ponds. Another lined, apparently, but they're supposed to be drained and capped and so forth. And, just another reason why coal's got to go. So this is, I'm not sure how, I'm going to talk about this. So the General Assembly passed a bill to prevent identity theft. So a bill that seeks to protect Virginians from losing their income tax refund to identity thieves won final approval in the General Assembly. This is from Mark Keim, a Democrat out of Vienna. Thieves can steal information from the payroll system of an employer payroll service and use it to claim a state income tax refund before the real taxpayer files a legitimate return. So that's great and all that. But there was another bit of news that actually, it's just funny. It's not funny, but they're focusing on identity theft. But according to a state audit of cybersecurity at the Virginia Department of Taxation, where the taxes are actually located, found that the state information partnership with Northrop Grumman has not been updating critical security patches to protect the tax department system. Now, maybe this should be more of an important article that we should have let off with earlier, but the audit said that at one point in August 2016, 1 critical and 490 highly important security patches were absent. The cybersecurity rules state that they had to be applied within 90 days of release. And they said they're working to make sure that the security patches are up to date. I just found it ironic that, not getting too far into cybersecurity and technical IT terms and stuff like that, but your security is only as strong as your weakest link. So if you have all these protections against identity theft, it really doesn't do anything if the critical systems that actually house the database and the other IT systems at the actual Department of Taxation are not secure. Obviously, there's a lot of issues with change management and testing that have to be considered during that time. I mean, you roll out one security patch that affects a lot of other things. So not going to give the Department of Taxation too much crap without seeing the audit reports myself. I'm not even sure if they're publicly available or not, but just something to be aware of. Other things that happened in the General Assembly this week: a proposed campus free speech law made progress through the GA. They shot down a bill that would have placed restrictions on how campaign funds are spent. Those of you that aren't a candidate might not know this, but there are literally no restrictions on how campaign funds are spent. So if you wanted to buy a boat with campaign contributions, you could. The opponents of the bill said that it would place undue burden on, make everything questionable. And they say that there's a lot of self-policing going on. I mean, obviously no one's going to buy a boat rather, because they would get a lot of crap from their constituents. But when you have, former First Lady Maureen McDonald spending nearly $10,000 of campaign and political action committee funds on clothing, then it becomes more questionable. But the Mark Cole, who one of the sponsors of the bill, brought up one lawmaker who came up with a scenario where he bought a box of donuts at a campaign rally and then shared some with family members at the house, and yeah, weak excuse. From the Richmond Times-Dispatch editorial, the leftover donut excuse is the equivalent of arguing that a private corporation cannot have a rule against stealing from the company because some employees take calls from their spouses at their desk. It's a ridiculous reducto ad absurdum. Goes on to say that state legislators should get a raise, a fact that State Ethics Commission recommended a substantial raise a couple of years ago. Lawmakers haven't had a pay hike in 3 decades, and you're looking at $17,640 for House of Delegates member and $18,000 for state senator, fall short of the reasonable compensation for the amount of work legislators do. In fact, the low pay scales creates an obstacle to average citizens who might otherwise consider public service. Amen. One of my arguments and part of my campaign is that when you have such low pay for state legislators, you're only going to get the independently wealthy, the retiree, or the well-connected running for these houses. I mean, I have to come up with over $100,000 for my race, and then $20,000 for, the session is only 2 months long, but when you're talking about running for re-election every 2 years, and then the amount of work you have to do within the community, it is very hard. The Richmond Times editorial concludes, raising pay instead of leaving campaign funds available for personal use might seem almost like an accounting change, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and unlikely to affect the lives of ordinary Virginians in any tangible way. But there is one big difference to the approach, the difference between honesty and dishonesty. In a state where the Virginia way has become a punchline, that should be more than reason enough. And last couple notes, the bill passed the Senate and House to mandate lessons on consent in high school sex education classes. And last bit of news as far as the General Assembly is concerned is that the committees have shot down medical marijuana oil expansion. On the one hand, and on the other hand, legalized purchase of cannabinoid oils for epilepsy. Now, this is a very weird thing here because the medical marijuana oil is not exactly legal. The General Assembly has given what's called an affirmative defense, which means that you basically have an excuse to get out of court if you get caught with it. And so what happened was that 6 House Republicans shot down a major expansion of Virginia's medical marijuana allowances last Wednesday, reducing the tiers advocates who thought they had votes for some reform. So there would have been 13 diseases. So they did epilepsy last year, and they would have added 13 other diseases or conditions, including cancer, to the list. And the vote died 5-6 in a criminal law subcommittee. The full General Assembly passed legislation 2 years ago allowing THCA oil and cannabidiol as treatments for intractable epilepsy. Senator Jill Vogel sponsored Senate Bill 1298, which would have added cancer and Crohn's to the list. Vogel's bill cleared the Senate. The House bill failed to pass the committee a few days later. I mean, the Daily Press article on this is just horrible. Delegate Rick Morris making votes to kill it. This guy has got to go. Gilbert voted to table Morris out of Carrollton. Delegate Jackson Miller out of Manassas. Mike Mullen out of Newport News voted to keep the bill alive. He was joined by the committee's 2 other Democrats, as well as Klein and Delegate Rob Bell, the subcommittee chairman. And of course, there's Delegate Collins, who was the tiebreaker in the vote with his silent no, was later quoted by the Daily Press as saying, "I am about to cry," as he left the committee room. Nikki Narduzzi, a Staunton woman with Crohn's disease, asked the committee after the vote, quote, "Can you tell me what we did wrong?" To which Delegate Collins replied, "You did nothing wrong." And for that, Delegate Chris Collins, representative of the city of Winchester and the counties of Frederick and Warren, receives the dubious honor of our shame of the week.
Shame. 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 Shame.
And
Shame.
regular listeners will know we like to end a show on a positive, upbeat note. We didn't do that last week for some reason, but we wanted to make sure that we found the time to do it this week. Via the bluevirginia.us blog, Yorktown High School students defend wave of diversity posters to cry post-Trump wave of hate. Now, this is Yorktown and Alexandria, which was very confusing because Yorktown, Virginia is actually here in the peninsula, so which is York County School, not York. Anyways, I'll leave you the link in the show notes to the video. Basically, there's like 5 or 6 kids that get up. The backstory on this is that they put up posters defending diversity and rejecting ignorance, racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and so forth.
Patriots know facts are not political. Diversity strengthens us. Science is real. Women's rights are humans' rights. Justice is for all. We're all immigrants. Love is love. Kindness is everything. We are Yorktown.
And what happened is that they put these posters up. I think it was students and educators within the school put these posters up. They were attacked by people in the school, Trump supporters, right-wingers, conservatives who felt like they were being assaulted or whatever. And so a lot of these kids got up and spoke out in favor of these posters. And I want to give a good shout out and recognition to these kids for their vocal support in front of the school board in favor of inclusion and liberal values. Well, that is the end of our time for today. Tried to keep it under an hour, but like I said, there's so much going on. We appreciate everyone that's tuned in. We thank you for your support. Please share on social media. Check out our website. And your financial support is always appreciated. For Virginia is a state political action committee focused on supporting progressive candidates and causes at the local and state level. Our podcast is meant to provide you with news and analysis of politics across the state, helping you get the information you need to be an informed citizen, battle right-wing propaganda, and to help progressives organize and activate where we are most needed. This is the For Virginia Podcast, episode 21. You can feedback on our website, on Facebook, or by emailing info@forvirginia.org. We'll continue working hard to bring you the news, information, and analysis to help keep the progressive revolution moving forward in Virginia through 2017 and beyond. My name is Michael Brandon Wade. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.